I've spent a lot of time talking about all the different ways you can do fantasy. We've spoken of magic, religions, what you can do right and wrong with your world building, and all sorts of other related subtopics exhaustively. But today we're doing something a little different. Today I want to discuss the idea of fantasy in general. It has a lot of unique qualities as a genre, and I've noticed over time those qualities are both boons and curses to the stories that use them in very different and very interesting ways. But more than anything, I want to talk about the purpose of fantasy storytelling. It's the most important topic within the subgenre, or really within any writing. What is its purpose? What is it setting out to do? And as said, how can fantasy assist that purpose, and how can fantasy actually harm it? This is going to be a bit of a different kind of video, less advice and more moderately scattered thoughts. But I think there's no other topic worth your time more if you're working on your own story in this wonderful magical genre of fiction. But we'll start with part one. What are you on about, JBat? In essence, the fundamental largest problem that exists within writers of fiction is what I'm on about. And to amuse myself and secondarily make a helpful point, I'm going to explain it by talking about why nonfiction doesn't tend to have this problem in the same way. After reading books like Tara Westover's Educated or Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, to take some fairly well-known examples, you'll never find yourself asking why they exist. The former is a memoir about Westover's experiences growing up in a zealously fundamentalist household in which her opportunities to do essentially anything with her life were about as stringently limited as one would expect of a 17th century Puritan household, with some added doomsday prepper fun in there too. The latter is a memoir about Hosseini's life growing up in war-torn Afghanistan, the absolute horrible tragedies that he goes through, and his quest to return and save the son of his childhood best friend. The reason these stories were written into books is never in question. These are retellings of real experiences that are authentic and in many cases pretty horrifying. Even if one didn't happen to enjoy reading them, it'd still take a particularly unreasonable person to say that they shouldn't have been written. And thus is the nature of good nonfiction, particularly memoirs. They are retellings of human lives, which generally we humans are interested in hearing about when their experiences are significantly different from our own, filled with danger, suffering, tragedy, and dramatic triumphs in ways that probably wouldn't play out quite that way in our own lives. Fiction doesn't have this buffer. And that doesn't make nonfiction better because it has it, nor fiction better for requiring the effect I'm about to discuss to be created organically. It's just a difference. Sometimes when encountering or discussing things with prospective writers, though, I find their fiction strikes much the same as would the memoirs of someone who doesn't actually have a great story to tell. As, of course, not all memoirs are good. Some are accurate, maybe even mechanically well done, but simply don't reflect experiences that work to be engaging or particularly educational as a long-form memoir. More succinctly said, some memoirs don't have purpose, but their having or lacking is inherent to the story that happened to the writer and their ability to convey that well on the page. Fiction has to fully invent that purpose and its reason for existing. There isn't a true story to be retold, so it's the author's duty to find a reason for the existence of their story that goes beyond their simple desire to write one. And that's because, I promise I'm trying to be concrete, but I'm getting somewhere, fiction is about writing truth as much as nonfiction is. All good stories convey something to us about the human experience. For a fairly easy to explain example, Crime and Punishment is about exactly what that title might imply. It's about doing wrong and suffering for it, both externally from the law itself and legal ramifications, sure, but more so about the ways that these actions torment the one who commits them internally. Whether it's through the paranoia about whether you'll get caught or not, or the guilt that comes to rack one's conscience, the internal turmoil is far worse than the actual Siberian exile Raskolnikov is convicted to in the end. Thus, Crime and Punishment has its purpose. It leaves you thinking about something afterward. And you could fairly say, but JBat, Crime and Punishment is literary fiction. That's not a fair standard. And you're essentially right. But just because you don't hold yourself to the standard of one of the best novelists to ever live, which you probably shouldn't, doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be striving to make your story mean something. And this is where we really get into why this video is even about the fantasy genre instead of just fiction, because that brings us to part 2, fantasy and frivolity. The absolute worst thing anyone can tell you if you're writing fantasy is that it is a frivolous genre. Who cares about magic and wizards? They're for children's tales. If you've been in the genre for long enough, or even just in the right place very briefly, this is a sentiment you will hear because plenty of people do think this way. Probably less and less over time, but still, it's a moderately prevalent attitude. The problem, of course, is that a small portion of this attitude can be correct. It usually isn't, especially not from the people who would most loudly espouse it, because they don't tend to actually expose themselves to fantasy. But still, fantasy can be, for lack of a better word, frivolous, and is even prone to it in a way that other genres aren't going to be. And that's easiest to explain by visiting fantasy's relationship with things like world building. Fantasy and sci-fi too, really, give the author essentially infinite license to just create things. And not only can they infinitely create things, but they can do it in low-pressure ways, and thus, world building is generally easier than actual prose writing, as I said back in the Sanderson video. But this relationship with world building ends up meaning that a lot of sci-fi fantasy exists because, for a lack of a better word, the author just has cool ideas. And cool ideas are great, but they aren't a story. Ideas are cheap. Over the last year-ish of running this channel, I've gotten a few comments or messages saying things like, JBat, are you worried by showing these things you're working on, people are gonna steal your ideas? And I've always unequivocally said no. And I've discouraged others from thinking this way when I've seen this concern expressed. And that's because all ideas, even really cool ones, are worth about as much as a pile of bricks. You have to build something with them first. A few years ago, I worked as a dishwasher in a pizza restaurant, and my boss would come up to me every now and again and say, you know, JBat, I have this great idea for a book. And he'd tell me about it, but he never actually wrote it. And I get why. He ran a restaurant, he was a busy guy, he was doing fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with him for not having done it, but all that idea has ever ended up being was something to keep his mind busy. Writing projects that are beneath the surface, 90+% world building by volume, are barely a step above this, at least to me. And I emphasize writing projects. I've had to clarify before, so I'll do it again. You can have a solely world-building project, that's fine, but that's not what I'm talking about. But when a writing project is not distinguishable from a world-building project, it becomes clear that it too is struggling to get past that idea stage and into the purpose stage. And sci-fi, fantasy as genres do sort of promote this behavior. More grounded stories aren't going to require quite as much behind-the-curtain developments, so with those you're either working on it by writing or developing more substantive elements like plot and character, or you're just not working on it. Whereas with speculative fiction, you can feel like you're working on it by world building, when in reality, a lot of that isn't going to actually help you. At least, not as much as you might think. So to return to my example of being willing to essentially talk freely about my ideas and my process, that's something I think I can do safely, because I could probably make one of these videos just be about fully laying out every character, world building fact, and major concept about the story I'm writing. I could give explicit details, explain why I did things and all that, and I still wouldn't worry about anybody stealing it. Because if it can be hard enough to motivate yourself to write your own story, it's not going to be any easier making yourself write someone else's, is it? The only reason I haven't made a video like that is because nobody would watch it. And so this all leads into why the more and more I make these world building videos, to be real, the more I develop almost a love-hate relationship with the subject. But let me explain myself. World building is both the outpouring of so much creativity, so many concepts that can be used for really interesting storytelling, and yet also it can be the obstruction to that storytelling. I'd go on to reiterate the example I've made a while back about how fantasy and sci-fi can often be inaccessible to readers unfamiliar with the genre, because they don't want to learn the scientific name of every fantastical shrub the author introduced into their world. But I got a response to it from a commenter when I previously said something like that, which essentially said, I'm not going to simplify my writing for others' accessibility. And fair enough, you can do that. So my point changes a little. If you're going to do these things that will inevitably make your story harder to get into, just make sure you're doing them for a reason that makes it an even trade. Warhammer 40k is to me the archetypical example of an almost impenetrable setting that you are definitely rewarded for coming to understand. You might have to watch a YouTuber regurgitate information about it to you for 10 hours to have any idea what's going on, or better yet, read things like the codexes yourself, But once you do have your head wrapped around the setting, reading the better 40K content with that understanding is a lot of fun. You can get immersed in that setting that is so thoroughly different from our real life. As variable as the quality of 40K's writing can be sometimes, when it's good, there's nothing else that feels the way it does. The key point I really want to get across here is that if you're writing a narrative, the world building isn't your story, nor can it meaningfully supplement it. Your story is your story. I've said it before, and I'll scream it from the rooftops until I can scream no more, that good stories are such because of plot, character, and theme. And world building is the stage those things stand upon. There's plenty of value in making the stage interesting and beautiful, but it isn't why people show up. That which stands on the stage is your purpose. And now we're going to move on to how fantasy can aid finding that purpose with Part 3, A World Constructed for a Reason. Yes, a fantasy world does give you the license to essentially piddle around, adding essentially unimportant details until you've got 200 pages of world building lore you'll never use. But it also gives you an opportunity to do something dramatically unlike genres outside of speculative fiction can do. And that's to construct everything about that world, all to serve your purpose. It's the best thing about sci-fi and fantasy. You've got the full license to do whatever you want with it, and so as long as you do a good job making it believable and interesting, the audience will go along with it happily. And with all that freedom, you can make sure that the world you construct down to the very last detail is appropriate to the point you want to make with it, that it all serves your themes. If Orwell had tried to write 1984 as a novel that took place within the then contemporary UK of the late 40s, it wouldn't have worked. Was the UK of the late 40s flawed? I'm not an expert, but almost definitely. I'm sure one could write plenty of compelling things about all the ways in which there were things wrong with it, sure, but could 1984 have been written in that setting? No. Orwell had to take a page out of the speculative fiction book. He had to change the setting. He had to completely warp time, geopolitics, and more until he resulted in the land of Airstrip 1 that the UK has become in that world. Only in Airstrip 1 does 1984 make sense, not in 40s Britain. Even in a setting like that, one can't help but wonder how this very artificial setup of three equally evil and totalitarian countries managed to come to exist like this. It's not very realistic feeling, but it still works because it serves the point of the story. But you, with your fully invented world, don't even have those constraints. You've got the spool and nobody can tell you what you can and can't do with the thread. There's no real history to compare what you make to in such a damning way. And yes, you can use that hypothetical thread to weave something that's kind of fun, kind of interesting to you, maybe enjoyable to others, and is otherwise the result of you throwing a lot of ideas in and trying to make them work. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with writing stories that way, but with such infinite potential, why not endeavor to make a pattern of that thread? Make it all contribute to the reason you're making this. The reason that goes beyond, well, I wanted to, anyway. The reason isn't something I can find for you, but I can tell if you found it yourself when I read what you make. Fundamentally, it is that reason that makes the difference between stories that get finished, and not only that, but which also become celebrated, and those which remain unfinished and half-written, or do reach their end, but to a collective meh from the audience. One of the most common thoughts I see floating around writing and world-building spaces is the idea of, you can add this because you can. And while not an incorrect statement, I find it an odd one in its circularity, and in missing the actual point of a statement like that. Why? It's because I see people in these speculative fiction spaces saying things like, I'm really hoping for a story with elephant people, wyverns, and 3 competing kingdoms. And I'm baffled that such a thing is considered a priority in the stories one is seeking out. It reminds me a lot of the ongoing trend one might notice on Book Talk, where you'll hear about people looking for enemies to lovers, light fantasy, tall, muscular man, shy girl, or whatever, and they get upset if a novel they're reading defies these tropes. To me, this fantasy equivalent is actually stranger than that. If someone is looking to consume a very specific type of romance and wants certain tropes, I think that's a disappointing way to approach reading, vehemently depriving yourself of surprise or discovering new things. but I do kind of understand it. One likes the buttered popcorn of reading and so seeks out more buttered popcorn and doesn't want to be surprised with kettle corn. But then I saw the above equivalent in fantasy, and I can only wonder how. Maybe I'm weird, but I'll read, watch, or play anything if I have a reason to believe that it's really good. Sure, I have preferences, but they're never fully exclusive. I don't want to know what tropes are in the things I experience. I want to find out for myself and be surprised. I don't think that's that uncommon of an opinion. And then, come to find out, people are writing for the sake of these kinds of tropes. One cannot find the elephant people story with wyverns and 3 competing kingdoms, so in some cases they just try to write it. It's a strange phenomenon, but we live at a time where so much media exists, and we're so easily able to filter things in and out of what we're shown that many people are never exposed to things that are outside their comfort zone. So people become prone to developing incredibly specific, granular tastes. And so, one wants their elephant people with wyverns and 3 competing kingdoms, and rather than thinking about making those aspects of a story with a purpose beyond that, they decide, with all the infinite possibilities of fantasy, I can write these 3 things. A plot? An actual point? That'll come later. It's the equivalent of receiving a magical box that'll generate any food you want on demand, and only requesting a Hungry Man TV dinner out of it every other Tuesday. Why waste that potential? You might at this point fairly say, but JBat, you're just ranting about TikTok and elephants like a crazy old man. What the hell is your point? Storytelling is about challenging our assumptions, about making us see the world differently. It's an effect unique to storytelling. There is no way to make a more convincing argument for something than to write a good story about it. There's no debate, no lecture, nothing that will convince someone to think about ideas differently in such an effective way than a well-told, enjoyable narrative. A simple example comes from yours truly. 2 years ago, I thought horror was a superfluous, stupid genre that relied on cheap jump scares and being grotesque to keep people hooked, and there was nothing beyond that. I thought the whole genre was Winnie the Pooh, blood and honey. That was a belief I held essentially from when I started actually thinking about genres all the way until like 2 years ago. And I was wrong. My opinion was incorrect. It's very difficult to have a factually incorrect opinion, but I did manage it. Now, for example, I've just finished the original 3 Silent Hill games and think they're absolutely incredible. Even if that one Shakespeare puzzle on hard difficulty did have me banging my head against a wall for hours. So when I see people who focus all discussions about their writing project on what color should the eyes of this character's great-uncle's cousin twice removed be, I get a little antsy. That's not to say you should never ask those kinds of questions. Talking about world building is fun, but don't be afraid to share your actual idea, your core idea. Not just the genre and the protagonist's favorite dessert. There's so much more to be gained from talking with people about their motives for telling their story. In explaining yourself, you may even find doing the very act helps you understand those reasons better than you did previously. Tell me what you're trying to say about the world. Tell me why you're driven to tell this story. That's what I care about. And to conclude this, my passion for this subject and the reason I made this rambly, probably sort of nonsensical video about this capital P purpose is born out of the fact that I wrote a purposeless novel as the start to my multi-entry series, which was a bit of a problem. And when its first draft was finished, something like 3 years ago, even then I knew something was wrong about it. That something, surprise, surprise, was that it was a story that existed for the sake of being a story. The characters were fine, the events themselves were fine, the world building was developed, but I didn't have that purpose, and so it lacked in direction and impact. It took me time to find that purpose, and the novel had to get so thoroughly redone that I only finished its final revision pretty recently, and it's essentially a different project now. But it's a night and day difference. And I promise it'll be the same for you if you're in that boat. But with that, I think I'm done rambling about my thoughts on fantasy and the reasons that it matters. I could ramble longer, but probably not very coherently. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about the capital P purpose of fantasy, I try to read every comment and would love to see your thoughts. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way. We have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner, Sawney, Isaac Parrott, those being our Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jodion Void, who is new, thank you, our Knights, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, finding the purpose for your art may be hard, ask me how I know, but it's definitely worth it.